Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of A Modern Nonprofit Podcast. My name is Tasha Anderson. I'm your host. I'm the founder and CEO of the Charity CFO. And what that means is basically I work with all things nonprofit, right? I work with lots of nonprofits all over the country. And I really especially like having conversations that aren't necessarily related to accounting. I spend enough time in the numbers, crunching numbers, and I really like to have meaningful conversations with nonprofit leaders on all different topics. And today I've invited an author, Rita. Rita is joining us to talk a little bit more about leading for justice, supervision, HR, and culture. This is a book, Rita, that you've recently written. And I'm curious to know, Rita, well, first of all, thanks for joining us on this episode. I'm really excited always to talk about culture building and supervision and training and development and really making an organization a place that people want to be at. But before we dive into the conversation, I'm actually curious, Rita, if you could tell us a little bit more about your story and what prompted you to, work in this space and talk about these things and do this research. So tell us, Rita, so what brought you here? How'd you end up here?
All right. Well, thank you, Tasha. I'm excited to be here and talk with you today.
Absolutely.
I started working in nonprofits. I've worked in nonprofits my whole career. And
Mhm.
when I look back, I think I chose nonprofits because I grew up the youngest of 6 children. And so
Mhm.
I've had a deep experience of not feeling seen and heard. And I
Mm.
wanted to focus on seeing and hearing and
Mm.
supporting people. And so
Mm.
nonprofits made sense. In
Mm.
terms of my specific area of focus, when I was working at my first nonprofit, which happened to be an AIDS agency. Um,
Mhm.
One day the ED came in the way of nonprofits and said, I got a grant, we're going to double our staff. Who wants to do personnel? And, you know, that's how nonprofits work when they're small
Yeah.
grassroots. And I said, oh, I will. That sounds fun. So then I
Mhm.
had to figure out what that meant and what to do about it.
Mhm.
So I went into HR. Along the way, I got my master's in organizational psychology. I've
Mm.
worked in several different nonprofits, and then I started consulting about 15 years ago.
Mm.
I work with primarily social justice organizations. And I wrote this book because I kept hearing some of the same concerns, issues, struggles coming up in the
Mm.
organizations I work with. And I wanted to really give people a guide to support their internal work to walk the
Mhm.
talk of fighting oppression. So that's what this
Mm.
book is about.
Okay. And for those of you that missed it, and we'll put it in the show notes. Rita, your book is called Leading for Justice, Supervision, HR, and Culture. So we'll put those in the show notes for anybody interested. And let's dive in a little bit more into kind of strengthening leadership for nonprofits and social justice issues for the benefit of everyone, right? Their clients, their employees, the colleagues, all those sorts of things. So, Rita, nonprofits, social justice is included, have unique challenges when it comes to leadership. And so more specifically though, what have you seen that's unique to nonprofits, specifically social justice issues, which we've seen more and more organizations focus on that specific mission recently? What do you see trends there?
Right. I think some of the unique challenges come in the way of the expectations of staff who choose to work in nonprofits.
Mm.
First of all, we have sort of an unspoken agreement that, okay, we'll take a little less money, sometimes a lot less money, but we
Mm-hmm.
expect part of things. We expect
Mm.
to have a voice in decisions that are made. We expect to be supported and be able to bring our whole selves to work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one area of unique challenges. It isn't
Mm-hmm.
only at nonprofits, but it's stronger in nonprofits. I
Mm-hmm.
also think the scarcity mindset that many nonprofits have bring its own challenges, not only in terms of fiscal resources, but also in terms of overwhelm and overwork and
Mm.
um, resources and just the practices we bring of feeling like there's never enough. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the two other I would like to mention, one I call Why is there a kitchen in the living room syndrome?
Mm,
This is what happens when a small nonprofit does what they did in my story and say, who wants to do this? And then, a few years later, that person leaves and you look at their job description and you say, why is our case manager dealing with tech issues?
mhm,
And it made sense at the time, but sometimes that's
mhm,
just replicated. And so you have
mhm,
to be aware of that. And the
mhm,
last issue I'll mention is that I have an HR background. I think the idea of supporting people through a true human resource function is really
mhm,
critical. And many nonprofits don't have the resources for that, don't
mhm,
see a need for it. And that leaves employees, again, without feeling like they have a safe place for support.
mhm. I can absolutely agree with so many of those different things. I like that. Why do we have a kitchen in the living room? I've had so many conversations recently about that, and I think that that's true for so many of the administrative functions of nonprofit businesses. And of course, I will echo that. Certainly, you've seen it on the HR side. I've seen that from an HR perspective or an accounting perspective, right? Well, we just had somebody that was good with technology, so they could figure out how to use our QuickBooks system, and then before they know it, they're doing accounting work. And I will have people confess, Tasha, I actually have no idea what I'm doing. I think I know how to use the system, but I have no idea if the information is right. So this is certainly an area that is pretty widespread amongst, I think, all of the administrative functions and beyond within nonprofits. So I love that. I'll start using that. Why is there a kitchen in the living room?
Right.
Um, and another thing is, it's no secret that everyone, especially the leaders of organizations, are just so busy. And you would expect them to be good supervisors and develop their team and mentors and sources of support, in addition to all of the other things that they have to do. How do you see supervision as a function of leadership?
Yeah.
How should they be operating, and what should we be expecting of people?
Well, that is really the heart of my work. My business is
Mm,
called Supervision Matters because I think
mm,
it is critical. And part of the problem is exactly how you frame the question, because that happens in nonprofits. You have a whole job,
mhm.
and then you're told, oh, and you're going to supervise 3 people, as if that's
Mhm.
just a little extra 2 minutes a week. Um, but
Yeah.
in reality, supervision is where the values either live or don't live, because
Mm,
the supervisor has the most direct impact on people's daily experience of what it is to work in that organization.
mm, mhm,
So, in terms of justice work, equity work, the supervisor is the one who determines who's hired, who's promoted,
mm,
who is rewarded or mentored, the raises. So there's a
mhm,
direct impact on equity issues, but there's
mhm,
also what behavior is supported, what is challenged, how are people taught to, not taught, but encouraged to treat each other, what does teamwork look like? And
mm,
that all goes back to the supervisor. And so
mhm,
I see it really as an investment. You will prevent problems if you invest time in supervision upfront. You won't
mhm.
see the savings you're making, but you will save time, money, and trouble.
Well, and you mentioned something too that I think me as a leader of, like myself as a leader of an organization, one of the kind of epiphanies that I've had is that this idea of typically people that become supervisors were the doers at one point, right? They might have worked as a staff or a caseworker or something like that. They're really, really good at the job, and then they transition into supervision. And oftentimes, I think basically in every instance, you have expectations, especially in the world of nonprofit. Not only do you just have general, developing of your team members and being good mentors, but sometimes you also have like licensing, credentialing and requirements. So really, we're not just talking about supervision in the way of, let me give you your annual appraisal. It's more really clinical supervision as well. And I think that we really underestimate how much time when you're split between still doing a lot, that's predominantly all of your work, most of your time. And then, like you said, adding on the supervision and then just wondering why the supervision isn't better because it's just simply not the priority. And so, what would the world look like if we shifted supervisors to predominantly supervising and truly mentoring and developing the team and less doing? And I know that sounds great in theory. And some of you all listening are thinking, well, that would be amazing, Tasha, but we just can't get there yet. We can't afford it or what have you. But, I've had to make some of my own decisions, and I know I'm not running a nonprofit, but I have to make really difficult decisions on investing more, and investing might mean more in training and mentorship for my supervisors to more effectively do that. It might mean investing more money into my salary budget to accommodate that segregation of responsibilities. But that's definitely something that I've seen when I get out of the doing, how much better I'm able to supervise. So I see that happening all the time in the nonprofit world. There's rarely situations where you have supervisors that just really just focus on mentoring and developing the team. It's just kind of a
Right.
luxury that we're not used to having. But at least how can we switch that ratio, right?
Exactly.
And I say this not just in non.
Excuse me.
Go ahead, Rita. Sure,
I
yeah.
don't think I've ever seen somebody who is purely a supervisor. But I think
Yeah.
if we can make the ratio of supervisor to staff more manageable, sometimes I
Mm,
see people who are supervising 10 to 15 people. There's no way you
mhm.
can effectively supervise. My rule of
Sure.
thumb is it takes an hour a week to be a good supervisor.
Mhm.
That doesn't
Mm,
necessarily mean you're meeting with people an hour a week, but
mhm.
prepping, thinking about what they need, looking up resources, connecting people, that time needs to be prioritized as an organization. So I
Mhm.
agree with you.
Absolutely. So, certainly that is something that will hopefully evolve too. But initially, though, what would you see as the key quality of leadership? What's the most important?
So in terms of leadership, which spans supervision in all kinds of
Mhm.
beyond supervision, I think the key factor of many is self-awareness.
Mm,
Because if leaders don't know how they show up and the impact they have on
mm,
people, they're not going to be able to be good leaders. And
mhm,
especially again in terms of justice and equity, if you grew up in the United States, we all absorbed some level of white supremacy. I don't mean Ku
mhm,
Klux Klan kind of white
mhm. Yeah.
supremacy, but that we have been trained to think of the dominant mindset that favors
Mhm,
white, straight, male,
mhm,
non-immigrant bodies. And
mhm.
so being aware of our own identity, our own baggage, our own lens of how we look at the world is critical to being able to support people for success.
Mhm. I love that. Self-awareness, that and I haven't really heard that, but that makes complete sense. I mean, just how people see you or feel like they can interact with you or approach you, how you handle yourselves in meetings, and it's yeah, I could see that. All eyes are on you when you're a leader or a
Right.
supervisor in some sense. And I've had conversations with people all the time, that my biggest work during the day is showing up and embodying a role model that people would look up to and feel like they're happy to work for and all of these sorts of things. I've explained this to people close to me that I actually have my actual work I have to do. I have to actually send this email. I actually have to have this conversation. I have to do these things. But then there's a whole nother layer of that self-awareness, embodying that leadership role, exchanging with employees, like being pleasant even if you're stressed, all of that awareness that you must carry. And it's kind of a secondary role, but it's always there. And so by the end of the day, you find yourselves really depleted from those two roles. But I really think it's important, to have that level of self-awareness and really own that as a key function of what you do, even though it seems really subtle and most people may not recognize it, but you recognize it. And so I think it makes a big
Right.
impact. Absolutely.
at the end of the day, being able to think back, the end of the day, the end of the week, taking a few minutes to go, how'd I do? How did I interact with people? Is there anybody I need to loop back to and clean up something? So that's part of the self-awareness too.
I like that. What else do you think leaders should be paying more attention to?
So I think the other big thing is paying attention to culture. Culture is this amorphous entity in an organization, and yet it has such an impact on people. And so a leader needs to be able to sort of take the pulse of the room. How are people doing? How are we walking our talk? That's where culture really, again, aligns with the organization's values or don't. And part of what happens in culture is there's hidden rules that we don't name them, but people who are in know the hidden rules, and people who don't are judged by them. So to explain this, one of the most common hidden rules might be, a leader who probably doesn't have much self-awareness and says, so at a staff meeting, what do you think? Do you think this is going to work? And, there's a new employee who's enthusiastic and has a good idea and offers a real suggestion. And everybody else is just quiet because they know the hidden rule is that was a rhetorical question and the leader did not want information. So I want to backtrack and say, I don't think that's a common one, but it's an obvious one when you think about it.
Yeah.
So other hidden rules are, how do we handle conflict? That, we say we want direct confrontation, but nobody ever does that. Or we want to resolve it directly. And yet people talk around it. So thinking about and looking at your hidden rules is a really critical function of leadership. And one of the ways you recognize them is when you hear somebody say, well, that's just common sense, or they should have known better. That's the sign that there's a hidden rule at play.
Interesting. Never thought about that.
I think the other part of culture that is important is looking at who's in the room, who's making the decisions, who's invited to the table. And do people feel like they belong? Can they bring their whole self to work and feel safe? So thanks for letting me expound a little on that.
No, I love that. That's absolutely true. So really kind of the last question I have, and it's really about when things don't go well between the staff and the leadership. More specifically on trust. Once trust is broken or there's a division, or you always hear people don't leave jobs, they leave their bosses. And I think trust is an important part. So where and how do you think leaders lose the trust with their staff?
Right, that's a critical question. And I think there are many answers to that, but I think a couple that really matter are, one, when a leader doesn't have the self-awareness and they think they're acting with integrity or being trustworthy, and yet the staff doesn't see it. That's a real disconnect, and there starts to be, some distrust. The other critical way this shows up is when leadership doesn't listen to their staff. Either when they ask for input and then they don't follow up on it. That happens a lot with staff surveys. Somebody, an organization will try to do a staff input, a satisfaction survey, but then staff never hear what happened with it. What were the results? What are you going to do about what you heard? And so that starts to erode trust a little bit. Like, why are you taking up my time and then not addressing what I'm telling you? The other way that happens is when staff bring concerns to leadership. I'm feeling uncomfortable with this partner you're having me work with on a regular basis. Well, it's okay. That'll even out. Whatever it may be, when staff bring concerns, if BIPOC staff bring concerns that where there are aggressive actions happening or statements, and again, nothing happens, then
Mhm.
trust is eroded, people start disengaging, and frankly, there builds over time a culture of complaining and cynicism. So paying
Mm.
attention to what your staff is telling you, making time to listen and problem
Mhm.
solve with your staff is a real trust builder.
I love that. So, Rita, all of these topics I'm assuming are, in your book. And of course, people can go check that out, Leading for Justice, Supervision, HR, and Culture. But Rita, if other people or people that are listening wanted to find out other information about your consulting work or training or your book, or what is the best way people can find you if they wanted to hear more about, all the work that you've done in this space?
Great, thank you. My
Yeah.
website is supervisionmatters.com. And if you
Okay.
go there, you can find links to all my social media. So,
Okay. So follow you on social media, but go to supervisionmatters.com
right.
and check out your book. Obviously, we can find that on your website as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, Rita, this has been an incredible conversation. And I think it's really timely too, with just all of the struggles that nonprofits are having right now with retaining staff and hiring staff. And honestly, the last 18 months has been really difficult for all of us. And so having to navigate through all of that. So I think supervision is just as important now, if not more important than it was, even 2 years ago. And I know that many nonprofits are going to benefit from this information. And certainly for anybody listening, if you want more information on how you can incorporate more of these principles, go check out Rita's work at supervisionmatters.com. Rita, thanks again for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.